All right then. Okay. Greetings all. It's Van and Vivian here. We're doing a Bible study on Zoom, and we are in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. And this study, we're launching into chapter 10.
It's lesson 14.
Lesson 14. So we've had a few hours now are posted on YouTube from the first chapter up to where we are now entering into chapter 10. Our lead verse is that there should be no schism in the body. Schism being defined as division. So this is what Paul writes: no division in the body, no schism, but that the members should have the same care one for another. Now, that sounds like a very simple statement, but the complexity here has to do that this audience, to whom Paul is writing, is not homogeneous. They are not just one belief. They're all Hebrews. That's who Paul is writing, primarily Hebrews, but they believe gospels which have some differences. Now, the study is one that is guided by a dispensational understanding of the word that is rightly divided. There are divisions. Unfortunately, most Bible expositors hate the word dispensation. They think it's a curse word. Actually, they just want it to be just one body of believers with no division. But there are divisions. And we went through the word dispensational, in our last study. So if you're not sure what the word dispensation means, look at the study just before this week. We use the King James Bible. We don't refer to the Greek. The reason we don't refer to the Greek is that the King James Bible is already translated into English. So the challenge is understanding the English. There's no benefit to me to understand something in Greek because I have zero comprehension of Greek. However, I have a little bit of comprehension of the English language. So if I use something like the Oxford English Dictionary, I can better understand the English words. So that's why we use the King James Bible, because it uses a good English, well laid out with good punctuation, and the Oxford English Dictionary, because the Oxford English Dictionary actually gives me definitions that are oftentimes keyed to verses. So they'll lift a word, or they'll define a word, and then they'll display verses in the King James Bible where that word is understood. And then we have a social media presence. Midaxvancouver.ca is our website, YouTube and Rumble, and Facebook presence. All right, so we're going to move right into chapter 10 now, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where the lead verse for the chapter that we've selected is, "Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God." So notice that Paul happens to see some divisions. He sees that there are Jews, there are Gentiles, and there is this organization called the Church of God. Now, the Jews did believe something. What did the Jews believe? Paul's writing to them. Then there's the Gentiles. What did they believe? They believed something. And then the Church of God. What did they believe? We will endeavor to answer that. And when we get to the end of the chapter, when we get to verse 32 of chapter 10, which we won't reach today, we will endeavor to share what the Jews, what the Gentiles, and what the Church of God believed, because Paul said, "Give none offense." So obviously, Paul is not finished with the Jews. In fact, during his lifetime, he was never finished with the Jews. He kept ministering to them. There is a strange doctrine that goes about saying that Paul spoke to the Jews and then gave up with the Jews and then just went to the Gentiles. That's an unfortunate understanding because it doesn't stand the test of Scripture. All right, now chapter 10 is a little complicated in its audience. There are three groups that are being, well, actually not three groups, but there are three ways that Paul addresses those that he's writing. In verses 1 to 14, which is what we'll cover today, his focus is on the call to be saints. Now, the call to be saints are identified in the letter. They are Hebrews. They were uncircumcised. In other words, they were cut off from the people because on the eighth day they weren't circumcised, and so they were cut off from the people. They ended up having no hope, but when Paul came along with his new gospel given to him by the risen Jesus Christ, they had now hope of salvation. So they are now the called to be saints. They are called by Paul. They weren't called by Peter. Peter didn't call them. They were ignorant. Because they were cut off from the people, they were ignorant. They didn't have the same upbringing as other Hebrews that were circumcised. Now, in verses 15 to 22, Paul addresses both the called to be saints and the saints of the church of God. There were matters that concerned both the called to be saints and the saints when they came together in fellowship. And we'll see that when we get to chapter 11. There were matters, and there were some differences in what they believed, and there were matters that they could irritate each other with their differences. And then the final section is in verses 23 to 33, where Paul really does focus on speaking to the saints. These are circumcised Hebrews, saints. They are of the church of God. There were matters of conscience which concern the saints. And Paul is going to speak to that. He's going to give them some encouragement. This matter of conscience came up especially when they ate at the shambles. And we'll go into the shambles. Shambles, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, is a place where meat is sold. It's a meat market. And so Paul is going to address this matter of the shambles and conscience in the last section. So this study, we're going to look at verses 1 to 14. And specifically now, the uncircumcised Hebrew matters for which they were ignorant. And we'll jump in, and Vivian will read the first 5 verses of chapter 10.
1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness.
Okay, so this is the first part of the history lesson now that Paul is going to give to the called to be saints, the uncircumcised Hebrew. If you haven't heard the term uncircumcised Hebrew, we are pointing to Genesis 17:14, where if a male Hebrew wasn't circumcised, he was cut off. And so there were these cut off. So he says in verse 1, brethren. So he's speaking to his brethren, and he would not that they would be ignorant. Now, today, the way doctrine is handled from the pulpit of evangelical Protestant and even Catholic churches, this matter is always referred to as being true of only Gentiles of the nations, of which I am an example, Gentile of the nations. It's true, I am ignorant. So Paul is speaking to me as well. However, there were those that were closer to Paul in that they were Hebrews, and he considered them brethren, and he would not that they should be ignorant. So who were those that were ignorant? the called to be saints. That is a term that Paul uses. Only Paul refers to those that are called to be saints.
Maybe we should give the reference. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 2.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 1, 2,
and Romans 1, verse 7, 6.
Yeah.
6 or 7.
Yeah. And then Paul actually distinguishes the called to be saints from the saints in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So if you're not familiar, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9.
Excuse me,
Yes, Ken.
that phrase called to be saints,
Yes.
could you kind of just maybe take a moment and reiterate the why that term was used? Like, how does that work? What does it mean? You know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yes, absolutely. I get it. So it's a good question, Ken, and I'm glad you asked it. So these Hebrews that were not circumcised. So we're going to Genesis 17:14, where Abraham gets the instruction from God that every male in his house, every one that would then descend from him, was to be circumcised. And if they weren't circumcised, the instruction was that they should be cut off from the people. So they're Hebrews. Abraham was a Hebrew. All those that descended then from his loins are Hebrews. The distinction is that some Hebrews were not circumcised. And they were to be circumcised on the 8th day. So for the first 7 days of their life, they were of the household they were of the Hebrews. They were of the commonwealth of Israel. They were, well, Israel hadn't been formed yet, but they were of the commonwealth of Israel. And the instruction was on the 8th day to circumcise them. Now, we know that Moses, for example, was slack in circumcising his sons. And in fact, God was actually going to kill Moses if he hadn't circumcised his son. His wife had to take action, perform action, and so and even when they got to the promised land, they had stopped circumcising. Joshua had to circumcise all the males before they could enter into the promised land. So there were these Hebrews, they tended to be very hit and miss with their circumcision. They were to be circumcised on the 8th day, and if they weren't, they were cut off. So we have then a population of Hebrews, and they were referred to as Gentiles. We know that from John, John 7? Where
yes,
is
John 7:35.
John 7:35, where the Jews referred to the uncircumcised Hebrews as Gentiles.
Living among other Gentiles.
Yes.
People like us.
So they're cut off. You cannot fellowship with a Jew, a circumcised Hebrew, if you're not circumcised. So they get cut off. So they are now the cut off people. Paul comes along with a gospel of grace. This is a mystery. Nobody knew this gospel. Nobody knew how the Gentiles were going to be saved. The scriptures speak about Gentile salvation, but how that was to happen was never clear. In fact, it was a mystery. So Paul comes along, he has the dispensation of the grace of God, a new gospel. And this gospel then is preached to these Gentiles, uncircumcised Hebrew, who were happening to populate the synagogues. They would come to the synagogues and have to sit separate from the Jews. And Paul was preaching about this gospel of grace. They didn't need to be circumcised. They could be saved without circumcision. So what Paul then does through the instruction of Christ is he gets a call, or he gets instructions from Jesus to call those who believe in Paul's gospel. Paul literally calls them, physically calls them. He calls them and he says, you are going to be saints. That is, you're going to be set apart. I'm calling you to be set apart. So these are those then that they were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. And we see that in Ephesians 2:12, part A. Now, why were they aliens from the commonwealth of Israel? Because for the first 7 days of their life, they were of the commonwealth of Israel. But on the 8th day, when they weren't circumcised, they were removed from Israel.
And really, it was the sin of the father.
Exactly.
The father's responsibility was to.
So they were alienated.
Exactly.
Yes.
They were alien. They could no longer sit with
Yeah.
the Jews.
Click
Go.
to the next point.
Now, next point is they became strangers from the covenants of promise. So Israel had promises made to them. For the first 7 days of their life, they were part of those promises. But then on the 8th day, when they weren't circumcised, they became strangers in that they had to move out. So a stranger is someone who has relocated from where they used to live to a new place. I mean, this John Wayne, what was it? John Wayne, where are you from, stranger?
Where are you from?
Where are you from, stranger? So when someone walked into town in a Western movie, one would say to them, stranger, where are you from? Well, there were strangers that were from the covenants of promise. I mean, that's just pointing to Israel. So we have aliens, and they are no longer part of the Commonwealth of Israel. They have had to move out, and they became strangers living in different places. And so they are now strangers they're no longer connected to the covenants of promise.
So, excuse me again,
Yes.
so using that same kind of reasoning, then we could say they were estranged from the covenants.
Yes, you could
Yes.
say that
Because,
they were.
because
Yes.
like you said earlier, the first 7 days of their life, they would have been under the covenant of promise, right?
Yes.
True.
And
Yes.
then they became estranged on the 8th day as they became alienated on the 8th day from the commonwealth of Israel.
Yes, that's a good addition,
Yeah.
Ken, because a stranger is only when the person arrives in a different area, then they're referred to as a stranger. But what you point out is very helpful. They were estranged from the covenants of promise because of no circumcision. And we have some examples. We have named examples of the aliens and strangers. In Timothy was a Hebrew.
Acts 16, verses 1 through 3.
Yeah. And
Found in the synagogue.
yeah.
Raised in the scriptures by his mother, but he
Yeah.
was still a stranger from the covenant of
Yeah.
promise.
So he knew the Hebrew language. He also knew other languages like Greek, but he was a stranger. He couldn't live with Israel because he was on Timothy was circumcised by Paul in order that Timothy could return and do some work with the Jews. So Paul circumcised him because of the Jews.
Mhm.
Titus was uncircumcised. Trophimus was uncircumcised. These fellows are all those that worked with Paul.
Titus, in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that Titus, he was not compelled to be circumcised
Yeah.
when they went to the Jerusalem council.
Yeah. So this is so poorly understood, and because it's poorly understood, it obscures all kinds of truth in the scripture about really what Paul's initial ministry did in order to achieve the promulgation of the gospel of grace. That is the spreading of the gospel of grace. It really was a work of Hebrew men. And in this case, they were uncircumcised Hebrew men who were called by Paul to be saints, that is, to be set apart for the work that God had given through Paul to them. And then they were referred to as soldiers, and they were fellow laborers with Paul. They labored, and they became members in particular. They had gifts, they had special abilities in order to do the work.
And vocations.
Vocations. They had specific vocations.
And there were members in particular.
And consequently, they were informed of Paul that the work that they are doing is going to be rewarded by God, because they actually suffered in doing the work. In fact, they were to suffer all the way to death. And so it was an arduous work that they had to do. And they're all gone now. There are no more called to be saints. There are no more saints, and there are no more of those that are called to be saints. So we, as Gentiles of the nations, we're saved, but we are without any saints in our population. All the saints are gone. Okay, so let's move on.
And actually, can I just say one
Yeah.
thing? The saints were to make known the revelation of the mystery, proclaimed by Paul, preached by Paul, to make that known in all nations, for the obedience of their faith, to prove their faith. And we see that in Romans 16, verses 25 and 26.
Yeah. So we've just done an extended sort of description of what the call to be saints are. And unfortunately, it is just not shared by anybody else that we know of. And so it kind of comes across as like a weird understanding. Well, it's scriptural, and one can put this together with much work at all if you just take a moment to look at the English language, and of which we even see that Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12 is poorly understood. In amongst right division circles, the Gentiles that are referred to in Ephesians chapter 2 are, by most right dividers, say that, well, that's me. I'm a Gentile, so I am the alien, I am the stranger. Well, I'm not from the Commonwealth of Israel, and I was never part of the covenants of promise, so I cannot claim to be an alien or a stranger from the Commonwealth of Israel. No, in fact, my ancestry, and I've shared this before, descends from Armenia. It had nothing to do with with Israel, nothing whatsoever. All right, so Paul says, moreover, brethren. So now he's speaking to the called to be saints, and they are his brethren in that they are Hebrews. And he says, I would not that ye Hebrews who are called to be saints should be ignorant. And he speaks about how that all our fathers. Now, Paul, see this, he's getting it right down to who they are and where they are. Paul is where they're from. He's attaching them again to their fathers who were under the cloud. Now we see this in Exodus 13.
Exodus chapter 13, verses 18 and moving into 21 and 22. Verse 18, but God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up, harnessed out of the land of Egypt.
So we see here that our fathers, it speaks of the children of Israel. Paul is talking about our fathers were under the cloud. So the children of Israel were those that left Egypt. So he talks about the cloud. So here we have a pillar of cloud. So I mean, this becomes pretty clear, simple English, that the fathers that are being spoken of are those of the fathers of Israel, and Paul is addressing brethren who share these fathers. I don't share these fathers because I descend from Armenia. So I have nothing to do with the children of Israel. This is very focused on the Hebrews. Now,
Can I add a comment?
Yes, go ahead.
I guess I just really understood or just saw where it says there, I would not that ye should be ignorant.
Yeah.
You know, that it's understandable, like if he's talking to the called to be saints, they probably don't have much understanding about their own heritage. So he would have to
Exactly.
say to them
Right.
that I don't
They
want you to be ignorant because now you're learning, that your fathers, the children of Israel.
So exactly, he's giving them an important lesson. He's telling them about their heritage, not about my heritage, not about your heritage, dare I say. He's talking about Hebrew heritage. Now, this is important because this is how the gospel got spread out to the Gentiles of the nation. It had to start with these Hebrews.
I didn't read verses
Yeah.
21 and
Okay. So
22.
Vivian will read verses 21 and 22 in the box.
And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of the fire by night from before the people.
Okay. So Paul he's filling them in on their own history of which they were ignorant. Many of them. There were some that were knowledgeable, like Timothy would be knowledgeable about these things. He was more versed in the scriptures, but most of them were pretty ignorant, not because they were stupid. That's not the point. It was uninformed. So Paul is informing them. And now, all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So now so I have to say, so what do we have here? Did Moses conduct a baptismal ceremony at the Red Sea? No, so we look at the word baptized, and we're all baptized, past tense. And I look in the Oxford English Dictionary, and the third sense of the definition of the word baptized is denominated. And you go, well, that's not much help. What is denominated? Well, actually, we're probably more familiar with the word denominated than we realize. So we think about denominations. So that's so I can say, what denomination
Did you come from?
did you come from? So I can say, well, I'm of the Baptist denomination, Presbyterian denomination. These were all denominated unto Moses. So they became of Moses denomination. So they weren't, this has nothing to do with water. This has to do with about how they were called and how they were identified. So they were really identified unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So my comment here is that all that came out of Egypt were called with Moses. So they're denominated with Moses, and they moved in the direction of the cloud and the sea. That's the way they moved. They moved together. They were of a common denomination. So there's a little bit of an explanation on the word baptized, nothing to do with water. It has to do with the way what is their denomination? It is unto Moses. All of Israel was of Moses' denomination. Okay. Verse 3. Now, this is the history lesson. Paul is continuing with the history lesson. He doesn't want them to be ignorant. So he's talking about these matters, and now he's talking about, and did all eat the same spiritual meat. Now, Vivian's going to read. We'll take a look here at Exodus chapter 16. We're going to read about the spiritual meat.
Exodus chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, It is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat.
Okay, so the same spiritual meat. Now, it's unfortunate the word spiritual means it's not tangible. It's, something from heaven, and it's kind of like, you can't put your hands on it, but this is spiritual meat. It had a physical form, but it was spiritual meat. and the Lord gave it to them to eat. So Paul informs the brethren, the uncircumcised, called to be saints, of the spiritual meat. And we go on now, and in verse 4, so
First Corinthians.
1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Now, this should, for us, have a lot of, we talk about the solid rock, the rock is Christ. And it's interesting that Paul talks about the spiritual rock. It actually followed them. The rock wasn't in just one place. The rock followed. They had a source of water. It was a rock. And I don't know what this looked like, but there was a rock that followed them, and they drank from that rock. They supplied their water. It makes no sense to me today for a rock to supply water, but for them, it was their spiritual lesson that God was among them. He was among them as a pillar of fire at night, as a cloud by day, and he followed them as a rock and supplied them with water.
Exodus chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me.
And notice it, they're almost ready to stone me. The people are thirsty, and they're murmuring. And we're going to look at this word murmur. If there's one thing that it becomes clear annoys God of the Hebrews, it's when they murmur. All right, let's continue on verses 5 to 7.
Exodus 17, continuing on, verses 5 through 7. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, take in thine hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not?
Okay, so this is you can see now there's a little bit of annoyance that is being built up here, and we'll be looking at this. What annoys God? Now let's look at verse 5. But with many of them, God was not well pleased. So many of these Hebrews, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now we're going to look at Numbers chapter 14. The language here, with God being not well pleased with them, the language is brutal.
Numbers 14, verse 32 and 33. But as for you, your carcasses, they shall fall in this wilderness. And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and bear you your whoredoms, until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness.
Okay, so God doesn't mince words with his chosen people, those that said that they would do. They said, "We will do whatever God wants of us." So it wasn't that they had their arm twisted. They volunteered to do whatever God wanted, and so now they're complaining. All right, we will look at now 1 Corinthians chapter 10 with Vivian reading verses 6 to 11. We're on slide 14.
1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 11. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come.
Okay. So this is very tough language, and really for many of us, it's difficult to understand why the language is so tough-minded. And for those of us that have been in the military, we can understand that when the commanding officer, and in this case, the commanding officer is God, when he speaks, he doesn't speak in pleasant tones. He speaks with commands and expects to be obeyed. And there's a price for disobedience, a price to be paid for disobedience. That's why this language is so severe. So these things were our examples to the intent that we, that is the call to be saints. Now I have to be very careful here and not inject myself in this, because the language is severe, the situation is demanding, the consequences are, well, they're absolute. So Paul is speaking to the call to be saints because they are required, since they responded to the call, they are required to serve. And Paul says that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So this is a command to the uncircumcised Hebrews, those that had been called by Jesus through Paul to be set apart, saints, set apart to the gospel of grace. That is the gospel, the gospel of Christ, the good news that his death, burial, and resurrection saves and actually it seals one, results in one being made a new creation in God, created in righteousness and true holiness. So there is nothing here that can happen to the call to be saints where they lose their salvation. That is not in view. What is in view, though, and mark this, is that they can lose their physical life on earth for lack of performance, and for doing things other than they were supposed to do. We saw that happen in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where one who had sinned terribly was then turned over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. That's how severe this situation is. I'm not part of it. I'm reading about it. I'm being educated about it. But for me, this is wisdom. These are things that are wise for me. It's a wise way for me to behave myself, but I am not under the command of these things. So I can take from this and say, this is wisdom. I should not lust for evil things, because bad will result for it. But it was different for the call to be saints. They were under, as military, they were under military law, commanded by Paul, and they could be punished very severely, not lose their salvation, but punished severely for lack of obedience. Paul expected them to obey in all things. In fact, he makes that clear. When we get to Second Corinthians, Paul is going to say he wants to know if they have been obedient in all things.
The proof of them.
The proof. Yeah, I'm not obedient. I'm a slacker. I've been in the military and I know what is required of a soldier, but I'm a civilian now and I know I'm a slacker. Neither be ye idolaters, as some of them, as were some of them, as it is written. Now, when we see these words, as it is written, Paul presumes his audience knows and is familiar with these scriptures. Some of them were, some of them were not, but they were all Hebrew. They knew something about the Hebrew scriptures. So Paul says, as it is written. Where is this written? We're going to take a look. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, when I read this, it kind of sounds like a church picnic. The people sat down, eat, drink, and then they rose up to play. So that's what happens at a church picnic, right? But this is not a church picnic. This is now from Exodus 32. He doesn't want them to be ignorant. And there's a lesson here for the called to be saints about sitting down to eat and drink and then rising up to play.
So I'm starting in verse 5b of Exodus 32, and then we'll move on through to verse 8. 5b. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play.
So there it is. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So Paul is taking from the scriptures, and this is part of his work now, so that the saints, the called to be saints, are not ignorant.
Continuing on, and the Lord said unto Moses, "Go, get thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves."
The severe language, they have corrupted themselves.
"They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt."
Okay, so this is corruption that is now contaminating those of Israel. God won't have it. When we see something that is corrupted, when something is corrupted, it becomes refuse. It becomes trash. It is to be cut out. It is to be removed. That was the case for those that were called, and they have agreed to the calling. You don't have to agree to the calling. The Hebrews could have said, "No, I think I'll pass up on it." No, they agreed to the calling. So when I volunteered for the military, once I took that position of being in the military, I couldn't the next day say, "Yeah, this is too hard. I think I'll go home." I no longer had that option. I was now in the military, and I had to continue through the course of service that I had agreed.
Go back to that verse again.
Okay.
It's quite interesting that they brought burnt offerings and peace offerings for the feast. But when
Yes.
Moses went up, they were doing beyond that
Yes.
molten calf.
So they made these.
They did both.
Yeah, there's the corruption. So they know the true God of Israel, but now what are they doing? They're worshiping a molten calf, and God becomes very angry with them.
That was the play.
Yeah. Okay, now verse 8. So we're on slide 17, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 8. "Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. That's a pretty big number of fornicators, Hebrew fornicators, that were of the plague were destroyed.
Numbers 25, verse 1 and verse 6. "And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab." Verse 6. "And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." Numbers 25, verses 7 through 9. It's a continuation. "And when Phinehas, is that Phineas?
Yeah.
Phineas.
Yeah.
And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel."
Okay, so the sin is terrible. Go back here, and there was one of Israel who, in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation, paraded a Midianitish woman. Moses married a Midianite woman, but he just went and grabbed a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and took the woman into his tent.
Because now they're under the law.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
They're under the law.
And they are not to do these things. They have commandments, and they are not to do these things. And so what happens now is that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, the priest of Israel, took a javelin and put the javelin through the two of them as they were together. And so that is what stayed the plague. Now we'll look at verse 9. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 9. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. So now we look at Numbers. So where did that happen? That's in Numbers 21.
Numbers 21, verses 4 and 5. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake against God and against Moses. Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? For there is no bread, there is neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread.
And our soul loatheth this light bread. So they hated the manna. Continue on.
Verses 6 through 8. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live.
Okay, so this is something where I thought, well, let's share a little bit of artwork because there's something going on here, and this is what we see here. Some of the masters, Numbers 21. 9a, and Moses made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole. So in this artwork here that we see this is Moses with a rod in his hand, and he is pointing to this serpent, which is on a pole, on a post. There's a man here on the right. His finger is pointing up at the serpent. Moses is looking at the people around him. They are in a tumultuous state of the serpents. There are some of them that are looking. There's some of them that won't look. There are some of them that have already died. They're white in death. There are some that are looking down at the dead. They're in fact, they're at the bottom right. They're death. They've turned gray. They're so dead. So this is a picture of what was, the artist's vision of what was going on. So Numbers 21:9b, and it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. So all they had to do was look at the brass serpent, even after they were bitten, and they would not die, they would live. That's all they had to do.
You see the mother holding her child, and the child's looking.
Yes, yeah. So and there were those that looked, and there were those that would not look. It's a very, talk about grace. There's a very simple thing they had to do, and some of them would not do it. Now, question. What became of the wilderness bronze serpent? So there's another picture of the bronze serpent with another depiction of Moses pointing to the bronze serpent. And I just want you to notice here that some of them are not just looking at the serpent. There's a fellow here on the right with a red cap on, and he's got his his hands up in the air. I don't want to say he's charismatic, but he's got his hands. What's he doing? He's actually worshiping the bronze serpent. To me, I would understand that as they were just supposed to look. They weren't. There was no command to raise their hands and or anything else. So
It's the image. He's worshiping the
he's
image of
he's
the,
worshiping.
the bronze
So
bull.
so what happened to the bronze serpent? It became an idol unto Israel. I'll tell you, it became an idol. And we go to 2 Kings 18:4, and for unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he, that is King Hezekiah, called it Nehushtan. Now, I'm not saying it properly, but it's a Hebrew word, Nehushtan. And I did look in the Hebrew lexicon, and in the Hebrew lexicon, and this is a transliteration of a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word Nehushtan is a thing made of copper or a thing made of brass. Now, brass is copper mixed with zinc. It's an alloy. So that's what they made. Moses had made a bronze that is a copper and zinc alloy metal image, and they ended up carrying this thing with them all the way through the wilderness, and they carried it right into the promised land, and it ended up being something that they burned incense to. 2 Kings.
Just a quick comment then. I wonder if this is what went on with Moses's bones, that God did not allow them to have Moses's bones for this very reason, because they would have made an idol out of his bones.
It's a good thought, Liz. Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
these people, at the drop of a hat, they would be.
Totally, yeah.
Okay. So who got rid of the bronze serpent? So it was around for a long time. It wasn't until King Hezekiah that we saw the bronze serpent finally was, and so
Dealt
we
with.
got some, dealt with.
2 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 and then 3 and 4a. Verse 1. Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. Verses 3 and 4. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father did.
Okay, so I'm just going to emphasize here, this is King Hezekiah, and King Hezekiah is a good king because it is in scripture in 2 Kings 18. We see here, Hezekiah, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. That's Jehovah God, according to all that David, King David, his father did. Now, he's not a direct, he's not
the son of
not
David.
he
He's
is
son of Ahaz.
he is of David's lineage.
Mhm. And he removed the high places and brake the images and cut down the groves and brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made.
Okay, so Hezekiah removed the high places. The high places were these where they had their altars. They had idolic altars, and they were high places. They had images. They worshiped these images. This is the people of Israel. They cut down the groves and break in pieces the brass serpent that Moses had made. And here I found this drawing, and this is here King Hezekiah, a depiction of King Hezekiah, and he's pointing to the pole with the bronze serpent on it, and he has one of his men applying a tool to break it apart. And if you look at the ground, you'll see on the ground there are arms and legs and torsos of the idols that they had also were worshiping. So they took this thing of brass. Hezekiah, took this thing of brass and they broke it apart. He said, "That's it. We're not worshiping this silly piece of metal anymore. We worship the one true God, Jehovah God. So I thought that this drawing was quite interesting.
Yeah.
Why do you think, though, the Lord would have used the serpent symbol as a curse and then also as a form of salvation?
Well, the
Well,
sting of death,
yeah, it's
the
just,
bite
yeah.
of the serpent brought death,
yeah,
and all they had to do was look at the symbol
yeah,
of that death and live, because God proclaimed, "Look and
Yeah.
live."
yeah. And I
And
have an additional thought here
Yeah.
for Liz, and that is that the serpent wasn't made out of a pure metal. It wasn't made out of gold, wasn't made out of silver, it wasn't made out of just copper. Copper was quite malleable. They could have made it out of just copper. It was made out of an alloy, that is two metals mixed together. That is a corruption. So the metal that was used to make the serpent was an alloy or a corrupted metal. And so this is a picture of corruption on a pole. And there's that understanding that Jesus was made sin
Yeah.
for us. There was no sin in him, but it was placed on him. So Jesus was made sin. And this serpent then is a picture of the corruption that was placed on Christ. So this is all the way back here in 2 Kings. And we have a picture actually in Exodus of the corruption that would be placed on a sinless Son of God to then heal really everybody who would look to him to live.
The serpent also symbols the sin that happened when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah,
Because they were tempted. She was tempted.
that's right. Yes.
And they ate.
Yeah, that's another good thought. So,
Could it also, part of it be that, they were told to look at it? Is that in a way God making them see and acknowledge their own wrongdoing? Like a confession?
yeah, for me, Ken, it speaks to the simplicity of what God expects of salvation, to be saved. It is so simple, but yet we have burdened it with all manner of responsibilities. Salvation comes as simple as what Paul said in Acts 17, verses 22 to 34. All God wants is for us to acknowledge him, the truth of him, believe him, the one true God, by whom we live and move and have our being, and we are healed. He doesn't need anything more from me because I'm not capable of anything more. He says, just look to me and live. All the people had to do, and we can see the consistent message in Scripture, just look to God. Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Just look to God and live. That's how simple salvation is. Forget all the doctrines of the churches who tell us all the things that we need to do, repent and confess and read your Bible and obey things and serve God. These are just layers upon layers of complexity that God himself has never expected of us. He just says, look and live. Now, verse 10, the word murmur. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured. Now, the word murmur, it doesn't sound like a terrible word, but actually, this is something, what the Hebrews did this annoyed God. To murmur is to complain in low muttered tones, to grumble. And what it is, it's a reflection of disbelief, that they didn't really believe God. They would believe, but then they wouldn't believe. They would believe, but then they wouldn't believe. So they were murmuring. They murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. And we see this then in Numbers 14.
Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said unto them, Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness?
Oh my, the things that they're saying. We continue on. We're on slide 26. We're in Numbers 14.
Numbers 14, verses 3 through 5. And wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt? And they said to one another, Let us make a captain, and let us return into Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel.
This is a mutiny. They said to one another, Let us make a captain and let us return into Egypt. They are rejecting Moses. They're rejecting Aaron. There's a mutiny going on here. They want to return to Egypt. They've already forgotten how awful it was in Egypt. They want to go back to Egypt. They're not believing. They're not trusting God. We continue on.
Numbers 14, verses 26 through 30. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation which murmur against me? I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel, which they murmur against me. Say unto them, As truly as I live, saith the Lord, as ye have spoken in mine ears, so will I do to you. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. Doubtless ye shall not come into the land, concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun.
Okay. So then, if you've been in the military, you know that you don't murmur against your commanding officer. It's not something that's acceptable. They were murmuring, and God says this is not acceptable. This is a mutiny, and so they're not going to. So that then what is happening to them is that they have been judged, and they're going to fall in the land. And the ones that are going to be allowed to go into the land are those that continue to believe, Caleb and Joshua.
They're going to die in the wilderness,
Yeah,
and
the-
others will go into the land.
The children. So the children before, the ones that were
Under 20.
under 20, they were not yet responsible. There is no equivalent to the age of accountability during this dispensation of grace. We're all under grace, whether young or old. But at this time, there was an age of accountability. Now we're going to continue on with verses 26 to 30 of Numbers 14.
Numbers 14, verses 26 through 30. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation which murmur against me? I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel, which they murmur against me. We've read this.
Did I go backwards?
Okay, let me just read it again, just in case. Say unto them.
Oh no, we have read it.
We've read this.
Yeah.
Okay.
I must have gone backwards. Anyhow,
Okay.
all right. We're on slide 29. We're looking at, I
Sorry.
don't know what my finger went backwards. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. Now, Paul writes, Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition. Let me just say the word ensamples is not equal to the word examples. Ensamples is a separate word, and it is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as, oh goodness, as a, I'm drawing a blank.
Pattern? Is a pattern?
It's not, no, it's not a pattern. I'm drawing a blank.
We'll get back to it
I'll
next
come
time.
back to it in a moment. They are written for our admonition. Our admonition, so the call to be saints had an admonition, that is a warning, a grave counsel. So the things that happened to them in the wilderness were not an example, but they were a
Oh,
precedent.
precedent, that's
That's
the
the
word.
word I'm looking
Yes,
for.
okay.
They were a precedent. In other words, that which happened to them can happen to you if you do not heed our warning. Paul, now get the language here, and this was never drawn out to me. This is how severe the expectation is of God through Paul to the called to be saints. He says you have precedents of God dealing with Hebrews
Your
and
people.
your people, and they have lost their lives, not their salvation, but they have lost their lives on the earth because they were inobedient. They didn't obey. So he's telling the called to be saints, pay attention. This is an important warning for you. If we do not do as we are commanded to do, we as well could lose our lives on this earth. But this is not salvation. This is life on earth, upon whom the ends of the world are come. So they happen to them, and Paul says, upon whom the ends of the world are come. My comment here is the ends of the world had come upon them whose carcasses fell in the wilderness. They lost their life. They had to give up their life because they would not follow the commands of their commanding officers. And that's just the way it is in the military. I am a civilian now. All of us are civilians. We're not in the command of Paul. We see Paul then now as someone who has wisdom for us, but we are not being commanded by him.
As the called to be saints were.
The called to be saints, they were definitely expected to obey and to be obedient. And Paul uses those words very surely with the called to be saints. The call to be saint, yeah.
Would these people who died in the wilderness, you know, where it says in Daniel chapter 12, some will be raised to everlasting life and some will be raised to corruption. So do you think these people who lost their lives in the wilderness would be raised to everlasting life in the kingdom?
You will go
Okay,
through the judgment.
so they're going to go to the judgment, Liz. That's a good question. And what we don't understand very well is salvation for the Hebrew. Now, these Hebrews, many of them, if not all of them at some point, believed in Jehovah God. And if we look at the faith to faith chart, we have a chart called Faith to Faith at our website under the charts tab. They believed in Jehovah God. And then some of them went on to believe not only in God, but also that Jesus is the Christ. But the first step in Hebrew salvation was to believe in Jehovah God.
Whatever was revealed at that time.
That was all that they knew. Now, when you ask the question, at the judgment, and this is why I can't wade in here, because this is between God and them. Each one of these Hebrews is going to be judged for their level of obedience. How obedient were they to the commands of God? And that's why Hebrew judgment is very complicated. My judgment, I've passed from death into life. I don't go to the judgment seat of Christ. I already know what my end is. They don't know what their end is because they're not sealed. Paul says that when we believe during this dispensation, what happens to us? We're sealed. And we are made a new creature. These Hebrews did not have the benefit of being sealed.
The ones in the wilderness.
Right. And even the ones at the time of Peter, they were not sealed. They had to endure. They had to endure all the way to the end.
To be saved.
There is no comparison between our salvation under the gospel of grace and the way these Hebrews are going to be saved by an order to obey God. And what I need to do is to keep the two separate. Leave Hebrew salvation with the Hebrews and whatever is involved there. But for me and for my dear wife Vivian, for all of us that are in this dispensation of the grace of God, all we have to do is just believe God unto salvation, and we're sealed, and that's it. No judgment.
So this is the difference between the called to be saints and the saints.
And the saints.
Mhm.
The called to be saints are also, they're sealed.
Like us.
The saints are not sealed. Okay, so we're almost finished here. There's no loss of salvation, but loss of earthly life
The called to
for
be
the
saints.
called to be saints. The called to be saints are sealed. These that were in the wilderness, though, they're going to be judged as to what it will come of them. So we have just a couple more verses here, 12 and 13.
1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 12 through 13. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful.
Oops.
But God is faithful. You sticky fingers
I
today.
know today I'm terrible.
But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it.
Okay. Him that thinketh he standeth, take heed lest he fall. So this is again a very severe warning. This is not talking about loss of salvation. This is talking about the possibility of falling, losing reward. So there are going to be levels of reward for these Hebrews. So then Paul encourages them that there's no temptation that you're experiencing, but those that are common to man. So there's no special, unique test coming to you. It's all common to man. And he says, God is faithful, not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able to bear, but will, with the temptation, make a way of escape that you are able to bear it. So the called to be saints are informed of God through Paul as to what to expect. The promise is for us today, for me today, the promise is that the believer will be able to bear whatever comes in my life. The promise is that you will be able to bear it. Now, it doesn't mean he's going to take it away, but whatever it is, I will be able to bear it. And as I look back on my years of life on this earth, I've bared a lot, nothing compared to what the saints bared. We've all bared something, and we've made it. We've been able to make it to this point. Now, 14 and 15.
1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 14 and 15. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry.
Okay.
I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say.
All right. So we're at the end of this particular study. Wherefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. So the idolatry, they were not just to take heed. They were not to take heed, but they were to flee. Flee from idolatry. All right, so we will end the lesson here, and next time we'll pick up with verse 15 and continue on to the end of the chapter.